Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, well, we're tackling maybe the biggest job there is parenting. I mean, you could argue it's the highest stakes commitment we ever make, right? And the challenge, it isn't just, keeping a child safe and fed. It's about shaping a soul, instilling values, preparing someone for a life of purpose.
It really is the ultimate test, no question. And what's really interesting, I think, is where we're looking for guidance today. We're zeroing in on one of the most famous and yet paradoxically one of the least detailed childhoods in all of history, Jesus' childhood. Our sources are arguing that even though we have, well, very few specific details, the actions Joseph and Mary took, the ones recorded in Luke, like chapter 2, verses 39 to 52, they actually offer some really profound actionable blueprints for faithful parenting.
Right, and that's our mission for this deep dive, isn't it?
Yeah.
To try and uncover those core, maybe non-negotiable principles. We're sort of asking, if you knew, absolutely knew, that the child in your care was the Messiah, the promised king,
Yeah.
how would you handle the basics? I mean, if Joseph and Mary, who, let's face it, were raising God incarnate, if they chose this specific path of dedication, instruction, ritual, what does that tell us about our own responsibilities
Yeah.
for the kids entrusted to us?
Exactly. We're trying to get beyond just, they followed the rules. We want to extract the spiritual philosophy behind what they did. It's not just the what, it's the why. Why prioritize these specific things?
Okay, let's unpack this then. The first thing, and it seems to anchor everything else they did, is this really strong, unwavering adherence to the law, right from the very beginning. Luke 2.39 says it pretty plainly, doesn't it? That Joseph and Mary completed all things according to the law of the Lord before they headed back home to Nazareth.
Yeah.
This wasn't like optional compliance. It seems like it established the fundamental structure, the commitment of their home.
Oh, absolutely. That adherence, it set the whole framework for Jesus's upbringing. It was a structure built on, well, recognition of divine authority. And that obedience started right away in infancy there in Jerusalem, with a series of very specific rituals dictated by Mosaic law. This wasn't really a choice for them. It was a covenantal duty.
Okay, so we need to understand these rituals, not just as, historical footnotes, but as actual spiritual statements. So what were the key rituals for a male infant back then? The ones that really defined this initial period of parental commitment?
Well, there are two main ones that declare sort of identity and ownership. First, you have circumcision. This was required on the 8th day. It was the physical sign, non-negotiable, of the covenant God made way back with Abraham and then with Israel. So by performing this ritual, the parents were physically demonstrating, look, this child belongs to God's chosen people. He's set apart, officially included in that covenant relationship. It was really the first act of spiritual inclusion.
So, okay, long before Jesus could even talk or be formally taught anything, his parents had already physically and formally dedicated him to that covenant. It established his primary identity right from the start.
Exactly. And that identity, it leads straight into the second ritual, which is maybe even more profound. It's the redemption of the firstborn. And to really get the weight of this one, you kind of have to rewind the clock, go back centuries to the terror of the 10th plague in Egypt.
Right, that was the last one, wasn't it? The devastating one where the firstborn of every Egyptian family, human and animal, died overnight.
Precisely. And that night, God only saved the firstborn of Israel because they followed it. His instructions marked their doors with the blood of the sacrificial lamb. So because God directly intervened and spared their firstborn, Exodus 13 establishes this permanent debt, you could say. Every firstborn, whether human or animal, was considered sacred. They belonged entirely to God. They were set apart for him simply because they were delivered.
Wow. Okay, that changes the whole dynamic, doesn't it? It means the firstborn child isn't just a gift. They're like a walking, breathing reminder of this historical debt of salvation.
It's even more than a reminder. It's really a statement of ownership, God's ownership. So the parents had to bring the infant to the temple to redeem him, which literally meant buying him back from God with a specific prescribed offering. This ritual, it forces the parents to acknowledge publicly that this child is, in essence, God's property set apart for him. They're basically saying, look, we get it. This child's life is only here because of God's grace, and we're just managing him on God's behalf.
That concept, set apart, needing a ransom, that's kind of heavy, and it leads directly into the next requirement, right? The act of sacrifice. And we know from Luke that Joseph and Mary offered 2 turtle doves, which, as the sources pointed out, was the offering prescribed for the poor. That detail seems crucial.
Oh, it's incredibly poignant. It's one of the clearest glimpses we get into their economic reality and also their devotion. See, the standard offering was supposed to be a lamb, a whole lamb. But if a family genuinely couldn't afford that, the law mercifully allowed them to substitute 2 turtle doves, or maybe 2 young pigeons. And Joseph and Mary offered the turtle doves, which tells us plainly they were poor.
Okay, hold on. If they were fulfilling the sacred covenantal duty and they were that poor, why was doing it right away so important? Wouldn't it maybe have been easier or perhaps even acceptable to, I don't know, delay it? Wait until they could afford the proper sacrifice, the lamb? I mean, doesn't the fact that there was an option for the poor, the turtle doves, suggest that poverty might have been seen as an acceptable reason for, a lesser dedication? Why is their immediate compliance seen as so exceptional?
That's a really sharp question. And the answer, I think, is key to understanding how Mosaic law worked. Yes, the law was demanding, but it was also, in its own way, profoundly merciful in its provisions. The redemption, the dedication, that couldn't wait. The child's spiritual status needed to be established immediately. But the quality or the monetary value of the offering didn't determine the validity of that dedication. What mattered was the sincerity of the offering, given within the person's actual means. So by rushing to the temple, doing what was required right away, and offering the bare minimum allowed by law, Joseph and Mary showed something powerful. They showed their adherence wasn't about status, wasn't about making a big show with a costly sacrifice. It was driven purely by devotion to God's command. Their poverty was acceptable because their compliance was immediate and sincere. That's what made it exceptional.
Wow, okay. That ritual compliance, then, done by these humble parents, it perfectly introduces this core principle you mentioned, stewardship. If the child is ultimately God's property, well, then the parent's role totally shifts, doesn't it?
It absolutely shifts the focus completely. You see in Scripture, children are referred to sometimes as God's inheritance or his property. Therefore, the parent isn't the owner. The parent is the steward, the manager, the temporary trustee, you could say. We're entrusted with looking after and managing this incredibly valuable asset that at the end of the day belongs to the owner, who is God. So our job isn't ownership, it's responsible upbringing, responsible care, using the owner's rules, the law, scripture as our ultimate guide. It just radically shifts the perspective, doesn't it? Away from seeing the child as, I don't know, an extension of the parent's ego or ambitions, and
Yeah.
towards seeing them as this sacred, temporary responsibility we have.
That perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a high calling, a really high calling.
Yeah.
And while, okay, Mosaic law isn't strictly what most modern believers follow point for point, the sources make a good connection, pointing out the parallel functions in modern traditions, like infant baptism or child dedication ceremonies.
Yes, exactly. These modern rituals, they often serve a very similar spiritual function. They involve a public declaration of parental responsibility. They demonstrate the parent's commitment, or at least one parent's commitment, if they're a believer, to raising the child according to God's word. It explicitly makes the parents the child's first teachers in faith. And it's also a commitment that pulls in the wider community, the church. They acknowledge the immense task, this burden, really, of managing this precious gift from God using his instruction manual. It's like an acknowledgement that this responsibility, it's too big to handle alone. You need the support of the larger spiritual family.
Okay, so the law and the rituals, they establish the structure, the who God owes the child and the what, we manage them according to his rules. But then how do we define the management style?
Yeah.
Once that structural commitment of stewardship is made, the real test has got to be in the day-to-day behavior, doesn't it?
Right.
Which brings us right into foundation 2, modeling character.
Exactly right. Structure without character to back it up. It's pretty meaningless, isn't it? And the sources connect this directly to the kind of character traits required for all believers, drawing heavily from instructions like those in Colossians chapter 3. The core idea is if parents are going to teach faith, they absolutely must live it out first, consistently. This is where, the rubber meets the road. How do they act when things are stressful, not just when they're standing in the temple making offerings?
And what are those specific character traits that Colossians says we need to put on as God's chosen people, the ones needed to create that faithful home atmosphere?
Well, the list is pretty much the bedrock of Christ-like behavior, isn't it? Compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Now, think about Joseph and Mary again. Their life wasn't easy, not by a long shot. They faced difficult travel, suspicion from their community, political upheaval under Roman rule, the poverty we just talked about, evidenced by those turtle doves, and then that terrifying flight to Egypt as refugees.
Okay, so how does that connect to modeling something like, say, patience in a practical way?
Well, patience in a home context, it isn't just about, waiting patiently in line at the market, is it? It's modeled when a child disobeys for the 10th time that day, or when your spouse makes a pretty significant mistake, or when circumstances just force delays and hardship on you, like a really difficult journey. Imagine if Joseph had constantly been snapping or complaining or just showing visible frustration during that long, hard journey to Bethlehem or the desperate flight to Egypt. That model of impatience would have been absorbed by young Jesus, regardless of any verbal lessons about patience being taught later, or humility. That means not constantly boasting about your status or your talents or your connections, but taking a quieter, servant-hearted role. The parent is always being watched. Always.
Yeah, that really hits home. Because the source material makes a strong point that children are just natural imitators. They're copiers. They don't just hear the words we say, they absorb the attitudes, especially the attitudes we show under pressure.
Absolutely. If the parent is, outwardly compliant, maybe they go to the required festival, say the right prayers, but inwardly they're arrogant or constantly gossiping or always trying to get an advantage over others. The child will replicate that bad example far more quickly and deeply than they'll replicate the good teaching. They're mirroring the emotional reality of the home. And this is why the sources identify the best gift a parent can possibly give their child. It's living out a genuine, modeled faith in their daily interactions, especially during conflict or stress. It's the huge difference between, say, telling your child, be gentle, and then handling a disagreement with your spouse with explosive anger. One cancels out the other.
That definitely highlights a big challenge, though, for
Yeah.
parents who maybe don't feel like they're Bible experts,
Yeah.
or who just feel inadequate to be the main theological teacher in the home.
Yeah.
It's hard to consistently live up to that high standard of modeling all the time.
And that is precisely where the supplementary but vital role of formal education comes in, specifically institutions like Sunday school or children's ministry or whatever form it takes. These structured classes exist in part to fill the gap, recognizing limitations in time, maybe specific expertise, or sometimes, yes, even gaps in consistent character modeling at home. They are a crucial supplement, not a replacement, but crucial.
But here's something interesting the sources mentioned. Why is it often that third-party teacher, not the parent, whose lesson somehow resurfaces years later in a powerful way? What is it about that specific environment, that formal religious instruction, that sometimes leaves a more indelible mark than even the parent's daily example?
It's a really fascinating psychological point, isn't it? The daily modeling at home is absolutely essential, foundational. But it inevitably carries the friction of the parent-child relationship. The authority dynamics, the discipline, maybe past hurts, just the emotional baggage that comes with family life. The devoted Sunday school teacher, though, often steps in as this kind of respected outside authority figure. They validate the parent's core message, hopefully, but without all that friction of home discipline. They're just there to share the stories, the instruction, often in a fun, engaging, dedicated environment.
They leave an indelible mark, as the source put it.
Yes, often they do. And it's frequently during difficult times, maybe years later, after a young adult has drifted from their faith, that those foundational stories, those core truths taught by a committed external teacher, suddenly resurface. They can bring that adult back to faith because the seed was sown early, sown consistently, and maybe sown without some of the negative associations that can unfortunately sometimes build up around parental rules and authority. So you see, faithful parenting really involves both things, the internal daily modeling of character and the external intentional effort to provide comprehensive, consistent instruction, often leaning on trusted, devoted church resources to help.
Okay, so moving from that intimate daily modeling within the home, let's zoom out to the broader annual cycle. Because here we see Joseph and Mary showing this incredible commitment to ritual consistency. This provided that comprehensive external instruction you were talking about. Luke 2.41 specifically notes that every single year they traveled all the way to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Passover. This wasn't just like a nice family tradition. It was a deeply ingrained spiritual rhythm that defined their entire calendar.
Absolutely. This annual journey really highlights how God used the whole cycle of Jewish festivals to structure the life of the Israelites, to shape their relationship with him year in and year out. And the three most critical festivals, they require this mandatory pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They were intentionally designed to disrupt the regular secular calendar and force the entire family, the whole community, to recenter their focus on God.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier that, okay, other cultures have festivals too, maybe for social cohesion, family reunions like Chinese New Year or Mid-Autumn Festival. But the sources stress that the Israelite festivals are unique because they're structured from God's perspective.
Exactly. They aren't primarily about family togetherness, though that happened. They're fundamentally about salvation history, God's law, his provision. They form a framework for teaching theology through action, through experience. And this consistency meant that Jesus was raised understanding that life operated on a spiritual timeline, not just a secular one based on seasons or harvests alone. They were embedding a profound theology through these rhythms.
Let's maybe break down the spiritual meaning of the three mandatory festivals, because they really do form a kind of blueprint for faithful instruction.
Good idea. Let's start with one. Passover, Pesach. Okay, deliverance is the main theme, we know that. But how did the ritual itself actually transfer that theological idea to a child? Well, the central teaching mechanism was and still is the Seder meal. It's not just dinner, it's this incredibly detailed narrated drama of salvation. Every single item on the Seder plate is symbolic, isn't it? You have the bitter herbs representing the bitterness of slavery in Egypt, the unleavened bread, the matzah, representing the haste of their departure, no time for bread to rise. The entire ritual is structured to provoke questions, especially from the children. The most famous, the most central question traditionally asked by the youngest child who can speak is, why is this night different from all other nights?
Ah, right. So that question itself ensures the whole story, the narrative of deliverance, is passed down orally, experientially, generation to generation, directly involving the child.
Precisely. And the response is a comprehensive retelling of the Exodus story, God powerfully leading Israel out of slavery. So this ritual fundamentally anchors the family year after year in the concept of God's grace and his deliverance, which of course in the Christian context holds incredibly deep future prophecy. Passover directly foreshadows Christ's ultimate sacrifice. He is the Passover lamb. So the parental application centered on Passover is fundamentally about teaching gratitude. Gratitude for salvation and the core concept that freedom isn't earned, it's a gift. It's given by God.
Okay, powerful start. Moving on, the second mandatory festival. 2. Pentecost, Shavuot or weeks. Historically, this commemorated Moses receiving the law on Mount Sinai. But the New Covenant focus, as the sources termed it, totally transformed its meaning for Christians, right?
It did. Under the New Covenant, Pentecost is forever associated with the dramatic descent of the Holy Spirit. As recorded in Acts chapter 2, it marks the birth of the church. So the focus shifts from receiving the law to receiving the Spirit. It's about empowerment, boldness, and mission. The practical parenting application here, therefore, moves from gratitude, which we learned at Passover, towards action, towards mission. It's about teaching children about receiving God's grace and the power of the Holy Spirit, which enables them to share the good news, to participate in evangelism and mission. It instructs parents to sow seeds of faith in their kids, fully expecting that those children will be empowered by God to share that faith with others, even globally. It's outward focus.
Okay, gratitude leading to empowered action. And then the third mandatory festival, 3, Tabernacles, Sukkot or booths. This one was a joyful harvest festival at the end of the agricultural year. What's the core spiritual principle this ritual reinforces?
Sukkot is fascinating. It forces this deliberate act of, well, transience, instability almost. The word Sukkot literally means booths or tents. And the law actually dictated that for 7 days, the Israelites had to leave their solid houses and live in these temporary shelters, these booths made of branches. Why? To remind them vividly of the 40 years their ancestors wandered in the wilderness after leaving Egypt, where they lived in tents and God provided everything for them: manna, water, protection. So the core lesson is about total dependence on God, even paradoxically in times of abundance right after the harvest. It counters self-sufficiency.
And it also had that beautiful social justice application built right into it, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The law explicitly commanded that during this feast of abundance, the harvest feast, people must intentionally seek out and include those in need. Specifically, it mentions orphans and widows. They were to be invited into the celebration, into the feasting. It was a divinely mandated time for charity, for sharing the blessings of the harvest. It teaches that prosperity isn't just for hoarding, it's a tool God gives us for sharing, for practicing generosity.
Now let's get into that really interesting connection to Christmas that the sources brought up. Why do some scholars argue that Sukkot in the autumn is actually a more probable time for Jesus' birth than the traditional December date?
Right. This is where we connect the ritual's timing and meaning to the historical context of the Nativity story. The main issue, or discrepancy, with the traditional December timing often centers on the shepherds mentioned in Luke's account. In the Judean highlands around Bethlehem, December is generally cold, often rainy, or even snowy sometimes. It's not typically when shepherds would be keeping their flocks out in the open fields overnight. They would likely have brought them into more sheltered areas or caves for the winter by then. However, the agricultural calendar of that region dictates that shepherds were absolutely required to be out in the fields during the autumn months, specifically around the time of Sukkot. This was crucial for managing the flocks, dealing with the breeding season, and preparing for the coming winter.
Ah, okay. So the biblical description Shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. That actually aligns much better with the typical weather and the necessary agricultural tasks of the autumn harvest season.
Precisely. And furthermore, think about the spiritual meaning of Sukkot itself. The whole point is celebrating God dwelling among his people, living with them in a temporary shelter, booth. Well, what is the incarnation? It's God leaving the glory of heaven to come and dwell temporarily among humanity in human flesh. Sukkot, therefore, beautifully symbolizes God's presence, his provision, his willingness to tabernacle with us. It fits the core theology of the incarnation perfectly. So this perspective suggests that Sukkot, celebrating God's dwelling with us, naturally connects to the essence of Christmas, which is about celebrating God's arrival, sharing joy, and mirroring Sukkot's command, giving gifts, especially to the poor. By observing Sukkot, Joseph and Mary were continually embedding this profound idea of God's provision and his very presence right into Jesus' upbringing through lived ritual.
Okay, so by faithfully observing these three major festivals year after year, Joseph and Mary were essentially embedding a comprehensive theology in their child through experience. A theology of deliverance and grace from Passover, empowerment for action and mission from Pentecost,
Right.
and total dependence on God's provision, plus the call to share from Tabernacles.
Yes, exactly. The overall conclusion on festivals that emerges is this. Observing them, and crucially, understanding their spiritual meaning, which always begins with understanding God's grace through Passover, ensures that our actions, our good deeds, our charity are done out of genuine gratitude to God, not for self-glory or trying to earn his favor. This annual rhythm constantly reinforced that everything good we have starts with God's grace and his provision. It built the necessary theological foundations for a mature, purposeful faith later on.
All right, so all these foundations, the strict adherence to the law, the daily modeling of character, the annual rhythms of the festivals, they seem to culminate in this really extraordinary moment when Jesus was 12 years old. It's that famous story of the lost child in the temple. And it feels like a truly pivotal moment for understanding the fruit of Joseph and Mary's parenting.
It really is. Luke chapter 2, verses 43 to 46, describes what happened right after the Passover feast ended. Now, the journey back home from these huge festivals was often, pretty chaotic. Families traveled in large, mixed caravans, relatives, neighbors, friends, all journeying together, often grouping somewhat by age and gender. Women and younger children might travel in one group, men and older boys in another. So Luke says Joseph and Mary traveled a full day's journey away from Jerusalem before they realized the 12-year-old Jesus wasn't with their immediate family group or among their relatives and acquaintances in the caravan.
Wow. Can you just imagine that slow burn panic turning into sheer terror, realizing the child entrusted to your care, and not just any child, the Son of God, is missing? And for 3 whole days.
Unimaginable. They had to backtrack that entire day's journey, then spend 2 agonizing days searching frantically all over Jerusalem for him. And they finally found him. But where was Jesus' focus? What was he doing? He wasn't lost and scared or hiding or misbehaving. He was sitting in the temple courts, right among the most learned theological experts and teachers of the law. And he wasn't just passively listening. Luke says he was both listening and asking them questions. And the text specifically notes that everyone who heard him was absolutely astonished at his understanding and his answers. Remember, at 12, Jesus was right at that preparatory age for Jewish adulthood when he'd take on full religious responsibility at 13.
So he wasn't just like soaking up information like a student. He was actively engaging, maybe even contributing to high-level theological discussion. And then when his clearly anxious mother, Mary, finally confronts him, she's just gone through 3 days of unique, profound terror. Jesus delivers this incredibly profound mission statement.
Right. And his response, it's often misunderstood, maybe sounds a bit dismissive to our ears, but it's absolutely foundational to understanding him. He says, "Why are you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" Or some translations say, "in my Father's house." This is the moment. This is where all that parental teaching, all that foundation laying fully crystallizes into the child's own self-awareness of his ultimate identity and purpose. Jesus wasn't being disobedient in spirit or disrespectful. He was clearly articulating his core identity and his ultimate mission, and recognizing that the temple, his Father's house, was the most appropriate place to be engaged in that business.
That statement, delivered at just 12 years old, it seemed to perfectly define what the sources called defining parenting success.
I think it does, absolutely. If a child reaches that level of maturity where they actively understand and seek to fulfill God's unique mission or purpose for their life, If they grasp that their primary allegiance, their ultimate business, belongs to the divine owner, not just the earthly managers, well, then the parents have been profoundly successful. And at that specific point, the parental role has to shift dramatically, doesn't it? It's no longer primarily about instruction or control. It transitions into one of support, assistance, and companionship as the now maturing child steps more fully into their God-given mission.
It is really significant, though, isn't it, that Jesus, even after making that profound statement, knowing his unique mission, he still submitted himself again to Joseph and Mary. He didn't just stay in the temple and say, well, I'm about my Father's business now.
Yes, that's the crucial final layer of that success story. He knew his mission, absolutely, but he also clearly understood and respected God's appointed timing and the authority structure God had placed him under for that season. He willingly returned with them to Nazareth, and Luke tells us he continued in obedience and submission to them for many more years until the appointed public moment finally came, likely around age 30. So the parenting foundation allowed him to recognize the mission early on, but his own character, his submission, allowed him to patiently wait for God's perfect timing to fulfill it. The goal isn't just knowing your purpose, it seems, but also having the character to patiently submit to the authorities God has placed in your life until that purpose can be fully realized according to his plan. #TagSwell1 Sykes. The challenge of uniqueness and final principles. Now, while we spent a lot of time talking about structure and law and modeling and rhythms, the sources we looked at also raise a really important practical caveat, something that brings reality crashing back in, the unique child challenge.
Right. Anyone who's raised more than one child knows this intimately. Every single child, even siblings raised in the exact same home under the exact same rules and principles, turns out completely unique. It's exactly why that parenting book or a strategy that worked like a charm for your first kid often fails spectacularly, even comically, on the second one.
And this isn't a flaw in the system. It seems to be intentional. It's necessary for the richness and complexity of humanity. The sources shared that little anecdote about the dream baby, didn't they? Which is just a perfect illustration of how wildly different one child's response to the world can be.
Yeah, tell us that story again, especially the detail about the vaccination shot that was telling.
Right. So this family had this first baby who was just incredibly calm, placid, settled almost instantly after feeding or changing. Just a very easygoing temperament. So the parents take him for his first vaccination shot, and the nurse, warns them, okay, brace yourselves, this might sting. He'll probably cry quite a bit.
Yeah.
The needle goes in, and the baby lets out just 2 little cries like, wah, wah, almost as if he's just asking, hey, wait, why'd you poke me? And then boom, immediately stops crying, just returns to perfect calmness. The nurse was apparently stunned. This baby just required very little active management, temperamentally speaking.
And that, of course, as any parent listening knows, is often the profound exception, not the rule.
That's the reality check, isn't it? So often, the second child arrives and is the polar opposite. Maybe colicky, easily stressed, highly sensitive, requiring completely different approaches to soothing, discipline, everything. The core principle here, theologically, is that God intentionally created every single person, including every child, as a unique, precious, valuable treasure, distinct from every other. This God-ordained uniqueness creates a wonderfully colorful and diverse world, but it absolutely requires adaptive parenting. What works for one child might be ineffective or even counterproductive for another, because you're essentially managing 2 entirely distinct, unique assets entrusted to you by God. It forces parents away from relying on some rigid checklist of rules that worked last time, and instead pushes them to rely more deeply on God for wisdom, for discernment specific to that particular child's needs and temperament.
Okay, so bringing all this incredibly rich, specialized detail together now, the rituals establishing stewardship, the daily modeling of character, the annual rhythms of festivals, and now this crucial need for adaptation to uniqueness. What are the sort of final synthesized parenting principles we really need to take away from Joseph and Mary's example?
Well, if we boil it down, I think 3 core principles really stand out consistently. First, it's stewardship. Truly recognizing deep down that our children are God's property, and we are the managers, the temporary caretakers. This means our primary allegiance in raising them must be to God's eternal rules and principles found in His Word, not to our own fleeting desires, cultural pressures, or personal ambitions for the child.
Okay, stewardship first. Second
Has to be modeling. Intentionally, consciously living out those essential Christ-like character traits, humility, patience, kindness, compassion, forgiveness in our daily lives, especially when we're stressed or tired. Because the most powerful curriculum is always the life we actually live.
Right.
What you do under pressure is ultimately what your child will learn and imitate.
Stewardship, modeling. And third,
And third, rhythmic education. Using structured, consistent times, whether those are the historical festivals we discussed, or modern religious holidays like Easter and Christmas, or even just consistent weekly family rituals like prayer or reading scripture together, using these rhythms to constantly reinforce those key theological truths. Reinforce gratitude for salvation like Passover, Easter, the power and call to share the gospel like Pentecost, and the responsibility and joy of helping those in need like Tabernacles, Christmas.
That really holistic approach, isn't it? Integrating the law, the character, and the rhythm, that seems to be the essence of what Joseph and Mary modeled.
Mm.
They created this environment where Jesus could not only learn about the law and the prophets, but could truly internalize his identity and his unique mission within that framework.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is how following the comprehensive example of Jesus himself, his entire life, his teachings, his obedience, actually leads us even today to naturally fulfill the spiritual spirit of those old festivals. We live out the reality of deliverance through Christ, Passover. We experience empowerment by the Spirit, Pentecost. And we're called to generosity and caring for others, Tabernacles, as part of our daily Christian walk. We embody the principles, even if we're not formally observing all the specific dates and rituals of the Old Testament calendar. Hashtag tag 7, outro Cowling.
Wow. This has been an incredibly detailed deep dive today. We've really examined two core pathways, haven't we? Drawn straight from the few details we have about Joseph and Mary's parenting. There was that intentional ritual obedience right from the start, establishing God's ownership and their responsibility, that idea of stewardship. And then there was the intentional rhythmic education through both the annual festivals and the daily modeling of character, all aimed at establishing purpose and identity in the child.
Yeah, it really boils down to grounding the child in two fundamental realities. First, that they are not ultimately their own, they belong to God. And second, that they have a mission, a purpose that's greater than just themselves, starting with those simplest acts of dedication and growing from there.
So what does all this mean for you listening right now? Well, maybe it means recognizing that the greatest curriculum you offer your children isn't down to a book or a program, but it's the life you actually live day by day. Lived consistently, anchored to spiritual rhythms and principles, but always adaptable to the unique, precious treasure that is each individual child.
And maybe here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on, something that ties back directly to the structure of those ancient festivals we discussed. Notice the divine order. The process of faith always begins with knowing, understanding, and internalizing God's unmerited grace epitomized by Passover before we move outward into action, mission, and sharing represented by Pentecost and Tabernacles. So the question for us as parents is this. If we rush to teach our children about doing good deeds, about charity, sharing, outreach, before they have truly grasped the profound nature of God's grace and their own need for salvation, are we actually guiding them toward glorifying God? Or are we unintentionally just teaching them a form of works-based righteousness, teaching them to glorify themselves through their actions? Getting that order right, grace first, then works out of gratitude, that distinction might be one of the most crucial things for parents to understand and to pass on.